Hello and thank you for viewing our webinar on contracted instruction. My name is Michael Watts and I'm a financial specialist at EdOps. In other webinars in this series, you will hear from my colleague Shelley Jacobs. As we go through these presentations, please remember to consider the key inputs to making a strategic decision other than cost benchmarking. Here you can see these questions, and you can also find these questions on the same page where you found the link to this webinar. In this presentation, we will look at how schools are using their contracted instruction budget and how much schools are spending on contracted instruction fees. This will include looking at the types of contracted services, the types of vendors utilized, the amount spent on these vendors, and the list of the specific vendors used. We were able to break the contracted instruction spending into 5 categories: enrichment and programming activities, tutoring, athletics, temporary staff and substitutes, and fellowship and residency programs. Of these categories, 90% of the spending goes towards enrichment activities, substitute staff, and fellowship and residency programs. Looking at the vendors on an individual basis, we found that on average, schools spent 0.2% of revenue per vendor. The most expensive vendors were fellowship and residency programs, and of the 3 main categories, vendors providing enrichment activities were less expensive and cost less than the average per vendor. Not only is it important to think about the cost per vendor, but you should also consider the amount of administrative work that is required to manage the school's vendors. Some vendors may be inexpensive compared to the total amount of funds spent on contracted instruction services, but that doesn't necessarily mean they will require less resources. For example, we found that only 5% of total amount schools spent on contracted instruction services went to vendors that were individuals. However, this represents 30% of the total number of vendors engaged during the year. While the comparatively lower cost may lead schools to believe that the contracts with individuals require less attention, it is important to consider the amount of resources required beyond the cost. How much time and salary expense will it take to have staff members manage the collection of W-9s, manage the collection and payment of invoices, and issue 1099s? When trying to find the correct services and mix of vendors for your school, keep in mind that there are a variety of vendors that provide services in each of the categories. The following slides list the vendors schools have used for enrichment activities, athletics programs, substitutes, and fellowship and tutoring programs. This list is also included within the handouts that are linked to this presentation. So to recap, the main takeaways are that contracted instruction fees are largely concentrated in 3 areas: substitute staff, enrichment programming, and fellowship and residency programs. It is also important to consider the administrative work and resources that will be required to manage your contracted instruction vendors, as this could add to the overall cost of your vendors. Further, your school should consider the drivers of price for vendors. If you know or are able to predict what drives cost, your school should be able to better manage and control the overall cost of some vendors. Your school should also think through the controls and procedures around these vendor decisions to ensure that the appropriate staff members are involved to balance the school's instruction need and budgetary constraints. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, and please take a look at our other expense deep dives exploring food service fees, contracted sped instruction, student transportation, and student recruiting.